Every woman in the room dropped into a curtsy. Every woman except one. It was a crowded November assembly in the year 1817, held in the county's finest hall for the arrival of Anthony Blackwell, Duke of Keswick, returning at last to his own estate after a long season managing family business in London. Candles blazing in every sconce, the local families turned out in their finest for an occasion that had been anticipated for weeks, and the whole room rose and sank into the deep, practiced curtsies such an arrival demanded, a great rippling wave of silk and deference that swept the length of the assembly rooms. Verity Colston did not move. She stood near the back of the hall, a vicar's daughter of 25 in a plain grey gown, and while every woman around her folded gracefully into the proper obeisance, Verity Colston remained entirely upright. Her chin level, her eyes fixed on the Duke of Keswick, with an expression the whole watching room could only describe. In the scandalized whispers that followed, as defiance too proud to bow, the murmur spread through the assembly like fire through dry grass. The vicar's daughter refusing to curtsy to a duke in front of the whole county, and Anthony Blackwell, who had crossed the room to receive the customary greetings of the assembled gentry, found his own attention snagged entirely on the one figure who had not bent. His composed public smile faltering into something considerably harder as he registered, with growing anger, precisely what her stillness meant. "Miss Colston, is it?" Anthony said, when he reached her, his voice low but carrying enough that those nearest could not fail to hear the edge in it. "I confess I do not recall giving offense sufficient to earn a public snub, though I gather from the room's reaction that I have somehow managed it. I have given no offense that was not already given first, Your Grace," Verity said, steady despite the whole assembly's fixed attention. "Though I do not expect you to understand the particulars standing in a crowded ballroom. Then, you will explain the particulars to me privately, Miss Colston." "Before this evening concludes," Anthony said, "because I find I will not stand in my own county's assembly room, being publicly humiliated by a vicar's daughter, without at least understanding why." The assembly, sensing exactly the kind of scandal that would carry through every drawing room in the county for a fortnight after, watched with undisguised interest as the Duke of Keswick withdrew to a small private anteroom, and Verity Colston, her composure never once cracking, followed him without hesitation. "Now," Anthony said, once the door had closed behind them, his anger still plainly simmering beneath a duke's practiced restraint, "you will tell me plainly what I have done to earn a public refusal of the most basic civility this county owes my title. Or I will conclude you meant simple insult, and treat the matter accordingly." Verity Colston looked at him a long moment, and the narrator will tell you that what happened in the silence before she answered was the whole turning point of everything that followed. For she had spent 11 months deciding exactly how she would answer this question, should the occasion ever arise, and found, standing before the man himself at last, that the answer came out considerably rawer than she had rehearsed it. "Do you recall a tenant family named Henderson, Your Grace, who held the Millpond cottage on your western boundary?" Verity said. Anthony's composed anger faltered into genuine confusion. "I recall the name vaguely from an estate matter my steward handled some months back. A rent dispute, I believe, resolved in the ordinary course of business. I confess I do not see what a routine tenancy matter has to do with your refusal tonight." "It was not resolved in the ordinary course of business, Your Grace," Verity said, and her voice, for the first time, carried a tremor she could not entirely master. "It was resolved by your steward, Miss Fitch, turning a family of 6 out of their home in the worst snowstorm this county has seen in a decade over a rent dispute he manufactured from a genuine but minor arrears, because a wealthier applicant had offered him a private consideration to secure the cottage for himself instead. I was there, Your Grace, I am the vicar's daughter, and I minister to the sick and the desperate in this parish, and I walked 2 miles through that storm to try to help a family I found huddled in the open, turned out of the only shelter they had. Because your steward's men had already begun moving the new tenant's furniture in before the Hendersons had even finished carrying their own belongings clear of the door. That is a serious accusation, Miss Colston, Anthony said, though something in his own certainty had already begun, visibly, to crack. It is a true one, Your Grace, and I would not make it lightly, Verity said. I nursed the Henderson children through that night in my own father's parsonage, having brought them there myself in the storm, because there was nowhere else for them to go. The youngest, a boy of 4 named Tom, took a fever from the exposure that night and died 3 days later in my own arms, Your Grace, because a man acting under your name and your seal decided a bribe was worth more than a family's shelter in a snowstorm. Before the Assembly's whispers could finish traveling their scandalized course through the county's drawing rooms, there was a long, terrible silence in that small anteroom in which a duke learned, for the first time, exactly what had been done in his name while he managed distant business in London. If a story of a proud refusal finally, fully explained is the kind that keeps you listening, stay, what Anthony Blackwell chose to do with that knowledge changed the whole shape of the weeks that followed. Anthony Blackwell sat down heavily in the nearest chair, his composed anger entirely collapsed into something considerably rawer, one hand pressed briefly over his own eyes, as though he could shut out the shape of what he was hearing. I did not know, he said, hoarse, when he finally trusted his voice again. I swear to you, Miss Colston, I did not know a single particular of what you have just told me. I left the estate's daily management to Fitch precisely because he came to me with excellent references, and I had no reason, in 4 years of service, to doubt his judgment on ordinary tenancy matters. I have been in London settling my late uncle's affairs since last autumn. I did not learn of any eviction at all, let alone the particulars of how it was managed, or that a child died of it. He looked up at her, his composed public face entirely gone. I have prided myself, Miss Colston, on being a fair landlord. I begin to understand, hearing you speak, that pride and fact are not always the same measure, and that a duke's good intentions mean very little to a family freezing in a storm his own steward arranged. I believed, for some months, that you must have known and simply not cared. Your Grace, Verity said. Quiet now, the worst of her fury spent in the telling. I have come to understand, this evening, watching your own face just now, that I may have been wrong in that particular judgment. Whatever the rest of it remains true. I did not curtsy tonight, because I could not, in conscience, show reverence to a name I believed complicit in a child's death, whether or not the hand that turned the Hendersons out was truly yours. I find I owe you the honesty of admitting that judgment may have been too hasty, even if the grief behind it was not. Do not apologize for a moment of that refusal, Miss Colston, Anthony said. I would rather stand accused rightly of a thing I did not know than be spared a truth I badly needed to hear. Tell me everything, every particular. I mean to know the whole of what was done in my name before I sleep tonight, whatever it costs either of us to hear it properly told. Verity told him the whole of it that evening, in careful, painful detail, the memory plainly costing her a great deal to relive even 11 months distant from the night itself. I had gone to the Millpond cottage that afternoon on an ordinary parish errand to bring old Mrs. Henderson some remedy for her cough, Verity said. I found the family already turned into the yard, their few belongings piled in the snow. Miss Fitch's men carrying the new tenant's furniture in past them, as though the Hendersons were no more than an inconvenience to be stepped around. Mrs. Henderson was weeping. The children were crying with the cold, none of them properly dressed for the storm that was already closing in, and when I asked Fitch's men by what authority they had turned a family out with no notice in such weather. They told me plainly that the rent was 3 months in arrears and the cottage promised elsewhere, and that I ought to mind my own business and let them finish their work before dark. She paused, gathering herself, and Anthony said nothing, understanding instinctively that the telling needed to run its own course without interruption. I knew the arrears could not be so great as they claimed, Your Grace, because I had helped Mrs. Henderson with the parish accounts myself not 2 months before, and the family owed perhaps 3 weeks' rent, easily settled once her husband's next wages came in from the mill. I said as much. Fitch's men did not care to hear it. I had no authority to stop them, and no time to fetch my own father before the light failed entirely. So I did the only thing I could think to do. I gathered up as many of the children as I could carry and lead, and walked them the 2 miles to my father's parsonage through a storm that had already begun to drift the roads waist deep in places. Tom was the youngest, not yet 5, and I carried him the whole way myself because his own legs could not manage the drifts. He was shivering so badly by the time we reached the parsonage that I did not think, that first night, he would survive it at all. He rallied for 2 days. The fever took him on the 3rd. Anthony sat very still throughout the whole account, and when it finished, he found he could not immediately trust his own voice to answer her. She drew, at the telling's end, from a small pocket sewn into her plain grey gown, a carved wooden lamb, crudely made but lovingly finished, and set it on the table between them. Tom carried this everywhere, Verity said. His father carved it for him the Christmas before he died. I kept it, after, because his mother could not bear to look at it and asked me to hold it safe rather than see it thrown away in her grief. I have carried it with me every day since, Your Grace, as a reminder of exactly what a careless steward's greed cost one small family, and I confess I brought it to this assembly tonight, half hoping and half fearing that I would find occasion to show it to you directly. Anthony Blackwell took up the small carved lamb with hands that were not entirely steady, turning it over slowly, tracing the crude, loving lines a grieving father's own knife had once carved for a child who would not live to outgrow it, and sat with it a long while in silence, the whole weight of a child's death settling onto him in a manner no estate ledger's cold figures could ever have conveyed. I will not simply apologize and consider the matter settled, Miss Colston, Anthony said finally, rising from the chair with new, grim purpose in his bearing. I mean to investigate the whole of this personally, and I mean to see justice done for the Hendersons and for Tom's memory both, whatever it costs my own steward's position or my family's reputation for having employed him unwisely. I ask only that you help me, since you know the particulars better than any account I could gather from my own frightened staff, who I suspect have known considerably more of this than they have ever troubled to tell me, out of fear of Fitch's own standing in this household. It was over the weeks that followed, as Anthony Blackwell conducted his own careful, thorough investigation with Verity's steady guidance, that the two of them uncovered the whole shape of Obadiah Fitch's 4 years of quiet corruption, inflated repairs billed to the estate and pocketed in part, tenants pressured into unfavorable renewals through manufactured arrears exactly like the Hendersons. A pattern of small, cumulative greed that had gone entirely unnoticed by a young duke too newly burdened with his inheritance and too trusting of a steward's excellent references to look closely at the accounts himself. You could not have known, Anthony, Verity told him, one such evening, finding him bent over the estate ledgers with a grief that had settled, by then, into something closer to grim resolve. She had begun, somewhere in those weeks of careful shared work, to use his given name without either of them quite remarking on when the formality had fallen away. A man who trusts good references and does not personally audit every tenancy dispute is not the same as a man who orders a family turned into a storm. You are allowed to grieve what happened without carrying the guilt as though your own hand did it. I find the distinction considerably harder to hold on to than you make it sound. Verity, Anthony said. A duke's name carries weight enough that the people beneath it suffer for his carelessness, whether or not his own hand did the harm directly. I do not think I will ever again leave an estate matter entirely to another man's judgment, whatever his references. He set down his pen and looked at her properly across the cluttered desk, the candlelight catching the tired lines that 4 months of grim reckoning had etched into his composed face. I confess I did not expect, when I inherited this title at 26, how much of the work would be simply learning to see the people beneath the ledgers rather than the figures themselves. My own father managed this estate his whole life without once, so far as I ever knew, troubling himself to learn a single tenant's name beyond what his steward reported to him. I had thought that the ordinary way of things, I begin to think it was simply a failure my own father never lived long enough to correct, and that I have inherited both his estate and his blindness in equal measure. Then you have the considerable advantage of knowing it now, while you are still young enough to correct it, Verity said. I have watched a great many men in my father's parish discover their own failures far too late to mend them. I find I would rather help a duke learn the lesson early than watch him learn it only after a second tragedy forced the matter. I intend to make certain there is no second tragedy, Verity, Anthony said, whatever the learning costs me. Their partnership deepened over those same weeks in ways neither had quite anticipated when the investigation first began. Verity found herself, more than once, called upon not merely to recount what she had witnessed, but to help Anthony understand the whole practical texture of his own tenants' lives, the particular hardships of a bad harvest, the small mercies that made the difference between a family managing through a hard winter and a family broken by it, the countless quiet ways a duke's careless indifference could compound into genuine suffering long before any single dramatic tragedy made the pattern impossible to ignore. You know this parish better than I know my own family's history, Anthony said one afternoon, watching her move through the tenant cottages with an ease and familiarity that spoke of a lifetime's genuine service rather than any performed charity. I begin to think I have been managing an estate I never once properly understood. You are understanding it now, Verity said. That is rather the whole of what matters, going forward. There came an afternoon, some weeks into that careful, grief-shadowed partnership, when the business-like distance between them nearly gave way to something warmer. They had walked out to the Millpond cottage itself, now standing empty since the fraudulent new tenant had been quietly removed pending the investigation's conclusion, and Anthony, watching Verity's quiet, sorrowful attention to the small garden the Hendersons had once kept, found himself close enough to her that neither moved to widen the distance between them. I did not expect, coming to this cottage today, to find myself wanting anything warmer than shared grief, Anthony admitted, low. I find myself wanting it regardless, Verity, and I do not entirely know what to do with wanting something so warm in the middle of something so sorrowful. Grief and warmth are not always opposites, Anthony, Verity said, though her voice was not quite steady. I have sat with a great many grieving families in my father's parish, and I have learned that comfort offered honestly, even in the worst of times, is rarely wrong, whatever propriety might say of the timing. Neither of them closed the last of the distance that particular afternoon, both understanding, without needing to say so, that the investigation's unfinished business deserved to be settled before anything else between them was. Anthony's hand had risen, careful and unhurried, to rest against her cheek, and Verity had leaned, just slightly, into the warmth of it before catching herself, both of them breathing a little unsteadily in the quiet garden. Not yet, Verity said, though her voice betrayed how little she truly wished to say it. I find I cannot properly separate what I feel for you from the grief and the reckoning we have shared these past weeks, and I would rather know, once this is settled, that whatever grows between us grows from something steadier than shared sorrow alone. Then I will wait for steadier ground, Anthony said, stepping back though it cost him visibly. I find I have grown rather practiced at waiting for the right things this season. But the warmth of that near moment carried them through the harder weeks that followed. A quiet promise neither had yet spoken aloud, and Anthony found himself, in the evenings after, returning again and again to the memory of her leaning into his hand, however briefly, as proof that whatever grew between them was not merely his own hopeful imagining. It was Obadiah Fitch's own growing desperation, as the investigation closed steadily around him, that produced the second and most dangerous move of the whole affair. Having learned that Verity Colston's testimony formed the backbone of the Duke's case against him, Fitch attempted, first, to discredit her directly, spreading a quiet whisper among the county's more censorious tongues that the vicar's daughter's account was exaggerated grief rather than plain fact, that she had perhaps mismanaged the sick child's care herself in her own inexperienced ministrations, and sought now to shift the blame onto a convenient scapegoat rather than face her own culpability in the child's death. It was a cruel, calculated fabrication, and it found some small soil to take root in among a few of the county's more censorious tongues, precisely because it offered a tidier explanation than the truth of a steward's outright greed. Verity bore the whispered accusation with the same steady composure she had shown throughout, though it cost her considerably more than she let show, for she had genuinely feared, through every hour of Tom Henderson's brief illness, that her own inexperience had somehow failed him, and Fitch's fabrication struck directly at the one private doubt she had never fully laid to rest. You did everything a trained physician could have done, and more besides, Anthony told her, finding her uncharacteristically shaken one evening after the whisper had reached her directly through a cousin's careless repetition. I have spoken with the physician who attended Tom in his final day, Verity. He told me plainly that no earlier care could have saved a child so thoroughly chilled through, and that your own swift action in carrying him clear of the storm at all very likely bought him the 2 additional days his family had to say their proper goodbyes. Fitch's whisper is a coward's last weapon, nothing more, and I will not let it stand unanswered. When the whisper campaign failed to gain sufficient traction against a young woman the parish had known and trusted her whole life, Fitch turned to something considerably more dangerous. He approached the surviving Henderson parents directly, offering a substantial private settlement in exchange for their silence and their agreement to publicly recant Verity's account of the eviction's manufactured cause. Mrs. Henderson, widowed of her husband to a fever the same hard winter, and desperate for any relief to her remaining children's circumstances, very nearly accepted, and it was only Verity's own swift intervention, riding out to the family's new lodgings the moment she learned of Fitch's approach, that prevented a settlement built on silencing the truth from being signed before the Duke's own investigation could conclude properly. He is offering you money to say I lied about your Tom, Mrs. Henderson, Verity said, arriving breathless and urgent at the widow's door. I understand why the money is tempting. I do not judge you for needing it. But I beg you not to sign anything until the Duke's own investigation has concluded honestly. Because Fitch's settlement is not generosity. It is fear, and a guilty man's fear is worth considerably more to your case than his money is. Mrs. Henderson, given the fuller picture, wept and thanked Verity for the warning, admitting how close she had come to signing away the truth for the sake of a warmer roof and fuller bellies for her remaining children. A temptation Verity found she could not judge harshly, having seen firsthand exactly how thin the widow's circumstances had grown since the winter that took her husband and youngest son both. Mrs. Henderson refused Fitch's offer and told the Duke's own investigator, when he called the following day, the whole truth of the desperate bribe she had nearly accepted, evidence that, laid alongside the mounting proof of Fitch's 4 years of financial corruption, completed the case against him beyond any further doubt. Anthony Blackwell had Obadiah Fitch arrested within the week, riding out himself to the steward's own comfortable lodgings rather than send an agent in his place, wanting the man to see plainly whose hand had finally caught up with 4 years of careful theft. Fitch, cornered, attempted first bluster, and then a wretched, groveling appeal to years of loyal service that Anthony found he had no patience left to hear. "You called it loyal service, Fitch, while you bled this estate's tenants dry and let a child freeze to death to line your own pocket," Anthony said. "Cold. I do not care what excuse you have prepared. You will answer for it before the magistrate, in full, and I will personally see that every family you wronged in 4 years is made whole, again. Whatever it costs the estate to manage." The whole shameful business of manufactured arrears and bribed tenancies was laid out plainly before the county magistrate over the course of a 2-day hearing that drew considerable attention from every corner of the county. Verity's own testimony, alongside Mrs. Henderson's account of the attempted bribe and 3 other tenant families' corroborating grievances, painting a picture of sustained, calculated cruelty that left the magistrate very little room for leniency. Fitch was convicted that same winter of fraud and criminal negligence, resulting in death, a sentence that saw him transported for the whole of his natural life, and the county's collective judgment of the affair settled, decisively, on the side of the vicar's daughter who had refused to bow. It was that same week, with the investigation's terrible business finally concluded, that Anthony Blackwell found Verity once more at the Millpond cottage, now being quietly restored under his own personal direction as a memorial garden for the Henderson family, rather than let to any new tenant at all. "I have spent 4 months learning what my own carelessness cost a family I never once troubled to know existed," Anthony said, taking her hand among the cottage's newly planted roses, the small stone shelter for Tom's memorial already half built behind them. "I have learned, in the same 4 months, exactly what kind of woman refuses to curtsy to a name she believes complicit in injustice, and exactly what kind of woman helps that same name find its way, slowly and honestly, back to something worth respecting. I came to you the night of that assembly demanding an apology I believed I was owed. I find, standing here now, that I owe considerably more apology than I ever imagined receiving, and I find I am glad, in the strangest way a man can be glad of such a thing, that you refuse to give me the easy deference I once believed my due." He drew a steadying breath. "I do not ask you to marry a duke who deserves your forgiveness, Verity, because I am not entirely certain I have earned it yet. I ask you to marry the man who intends to spend the whole of his life earning it, one honest reckoning at a time, if you will have him." The kiss she gave him then, in the small memorial garden built from a family's tragedy and a duke's genuine remorse, was quiet and certain, and what broke open in Verity was the plain astonishment of watching a proud refusal transform, over 4 hard months, into the deepest respect she had ever felt for anyone. Word of the whole affair traveled through the county with the particular speed such reversals always find, and the same drawing rooms that had once scandalized over a vicar's daughter's refusal to curtsy now spoke of her, almost universally, with genuine admiration, a young woman who had carried a dying child through a storm, borne a coward's fabricated slander without flinching, and helped bring a corrupt steward's 4 years of quiet cruelty into the full light of a magistrate's judgment. More than one family who had once whispered disapproval at the assembly found themselves, within the season, seeking Verity's own good opinion rather than the reverse. Mrs. Henderson and her remaining children were resettled, at the Duke's own considerable expense, on a better holding with a properly witnessed and permanently protected lease, the terms drawn up personally by Anthony's own solicitor, rather than left to any steward's future discretion. And the widow wrote to Verity every Christmas thereafter, a small, steady correspondence that neither woman ever let lapse. Anthony made a standing practice, for the whole of the rest of his life, of personally reviewing every tenancy matter on his estate rather than trusting the task entirely to another man's judgment ever again, walking his own boundaries twice yearly and learning, in time, the name and circumstance of every family whose livelihood depended on his careful stewardship, a habit the county came to regard, within a few short years, as rather remarkable in a man of his rank. Though Anthony himself never spoke of it as anything more than the plain minimum a title's privilege ought to require in return. They were married the following spring, in the same small parish church where Verity's own father had served the whole of her life, and the wedding breakfast that followed was attended by a considerable gathering of tenant families who would, in an earlier season, never have thought themselves welcome at a duke's marriage celebration at all. For Anthony had insisted, plainly, that a marriage built on the reckoning of the past 4 months ought to begin as it meant to continue, with every soul on his estate genuinely included rather than merely tolerated at its edges. The small carved wooden lamb that had once belonged to Tom Henderson found a permanent place, framed under glass, in the Memorial Garden's small stone shelter, alongside a plaque bearing the boy's name and the simple truth of what had happened to him. For Anthony had decided, in the months of reckoning that followed, that a family's grief deserved to be remembered honestly rather than quietly. Buried beneath a great house's more comfortable version of events, Verity visited the little memorial garden every spring for the whole of her life after, tending the roses that had first bloomed there the season of Anthony's reckoning, and told her own children, when they were old enough to understand it, the whole story plainly. The storm, the small boy carried through the snow, and the proud, frightened refusal to bow that had, in the end, changed an entire estate's future for the better.